Okay, good morning, everyone. This is the POR Working Group Subgroup meeting for requirements. This was kind of a condensed meeting today, just to kind of finalize basically the issues that we're going to poll the entire group for later this week, leading up to next week's whole work group meeting.
Did you want me to go ahead?
Yes, and
Okay, so for this group, I guess there are two main issues we landed on as far as the polling is concerned, and then a couple of other issues that we talked about being discussed in the report. So the main issue in the requirement subgroup was, just a second, let me turn my phone off, was the extension language, whether to limit the reincarceration extensions in the statute. And I had proposed some language that I worked on with Chris and Stacy that breaks that paragraph down into three kind of sub paragraphs for reincarceration. The first one addresses new violations or new offense and violation of any of the crimes against the person statutes. And then we added terroristic threat and violations of like no contact orders, OFPs. There was some discussion. We had taken out the weapons language. I'm not sure where we landed with that. Right now, I think in the form it's in, that is not included in the language, the two crimes against the person, weapons sections. Then I submitted some language after. There was also some discussion that there were other things missing that people thought should be in there. And we talked about doing any felonies, requiring extensions for any felonies. So I got that language over to the chairs and to Mark to include. So it would be any of the crimes against the persons we talked about, or any other felony violation of law. And then, so that's kind of what the extensions would be limited to under. And it would be either new conviction for any of those or any revocation, probation violation, supervised release or conditional release violation for those offenses in the statute. And Mark, where are you at with that? With the language as far as is the felony language on the website yet or not yet? Because I know Stacy just replied on that.
so on the polling question, or
no, on the as far as the language that I sent over.
Okay.
With the felony.
Yeah.
Is that something you can?
Yep, I can share that. So
bring up or not? Okay. Okay, so all I really did differently than before is this paragraph 2 initially had just felony level violations of 3 of the crimes against the person statutes. So instead of just having those felony level violations, I just took those out. So that would be any felony violation, level violation of law. And I took those out because it would be redundant to specify those 3 statutes when we already were going to require all felonies or recommend all felonies be required. So that's the main thing. And then you can see the same thing in paragraph 3 added that for the revocations. And so, then go ahead.
Yeah. So essentially on this, what it does is it removes the misdemeanor restarts, right?
Well, the misdemeanors, it would still apply to potentially to a crime against a person that was resolved as a misdemeanor, because that goes by the offense. But the main thing is it would get rid of things like disorderly conduct. That's the one that I always think of, but it would get rid of minor misdemeanor offenses, triggering restarts. Well, I guess for that matter, like traffic offenses that, that are misdemeanors, that somebody like a DUI wouldn't trigger a restart under this if it was a misdemeanor or gross misdemeanor, things like that.
So, so the question ends up being, with that type of language, would be presented to the whole group. There would be a polling question on that. You'd have the reference language here. It's probably not necessary to get into the minor details of what that language should be, because that can probably be handled in the drafting stages leading up to the final approval by the working group of the report and recommendations. But the important thing is to get the sense of the working group, whether there is support for this change, essentially removing most but not all misdemeanors from the restart. Do you think that's a correct interpretation, Angie? As you noted, not for crimes against the person, those might include misdemeanors also.
As would potentially registration offenses if it was, something that started out as a charged felony and was resolved as less, but same set of circumstances, those would still fall under that.
Yep.
Okay, and then any other questions or concerns or discussion on what's going on with that language?
Yep. Here, Karen. I'll have to have Kendra.
Okay, that took a couple clicks. Sorry, my video is not working today and I don't know why. I've tried everything, but so I was having trouble catching up with the description of where you're all at with this, but I guess the couple just drafting issues that come to mind is, why the different descriptions of felony level violation of law or felony level offense? Is it just any felony, period? And then do we mean felony level conviction? Because that always leads to the case law disagreements about what if they get a gross misdemeanor sentence and level of conviction. So just clarity around that always helps.
Yeah, and that's my bad. When I was putting the language together, I'm the one who did that inconsistently, but that is something that I thought of, and as Mark said, it's something that would have to be figured out in the language, but I think the thought was that those would be convictions.
Yeah, if they're deemed a misdemeanor rather than a felony, that it wouldn't be included, but if it is a crime against the person, whether it was deemed a misdemeanor or not, it would still be a restart. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah.
But the paragraph 2 of the felony level violation, or paragraph 3 where I had the inconsistent felony level offense language, I think the thinking was that those would refer to convictions.
Well, it refers to convictions, but it doesn't say at what level of offense. I think that's, Mark, you're understanding what I'm saying there, right?
Yeah.
If they're convicted of the felony, but given a gross misdemeanor sentence, is that still qualifying or not?
That would not qualify, except in number 1, where it actually lists the statutes for crimes against the person. So it's a little bit complicated on that, but yeah, I understand your question there, Karen, on whether it's deemed a felony or deemed a misdemeanor. But number two would be, my understanding, Angie, is that it would have to be deemed a felony. And then three is just a revocation on either one or two. Does that make sense, Karen?
Yeah, I
Is-
mean,
I think
I'm just suggesting that you remove any doubt as to what you mean. And then, if this is how you're going to structure it, since it starts with due to a conviction for any felony level of offense, you would just maybe add that is sentenced as a felony, or just something that leaves no room for.
Yep, and that's something that in this drafting over this next month that we can detail as you see the language, and then we can get down into more detail on it. But yes, absolutely a good observation on that. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. My questions and my concerns are similar to Karen's, and that is the excessive use of downward departure in the state of Minnesota. Last statistic I saw was over 25% were downward departures after a plea has already been arrived at. So I don't know that the legislature would have much appetite for this, because how many instances do we have where they've been charged with a much higher level and pled down, and now you've got it here where it's only a conviction at a felony level, except for the crimes against the person? I don't know what gross misdemeanors are left out. I wish I could see that list. I don't know what misdemeanors are left out, but yeah, I would, there's a reason why the legislature put it as a charge as opposed to a conviction. And I know that's problematic, but this is going kind of the extreme in the other direction. And I would say, given the political environment right now and the explosion of crime happening, particularly in Minneapolis and St. Paul, I don't see this getting very far in the legislature.
And this is just for the extension language. This is not for registration, though. You get that? Okay.
I do.
Okay.
I'm fully aware of what it is. I'm just saying,
Okay.
This is highly problematic. Gross misdemeanors are not here. I'd have to see a list of misdemeanors to really grapple with. I understand crimes against a person. I know that list well, but it's kind of hard to do the reverse, to go, okay, what's missing?
Right.
And I could tell you right now, there are probably 2 people on the entire public safety committee that would have the expertise to quickly go through that and go, okay, well, this and this are missing. And one of them is probably a researcher. So, but I know it's our job to go through and understand it all. I'm just saying that I think gross misdemeanors should be considered. I'd like to see a list of what's left off, I guess, is also quite helpful. I'm assuming like certain levels of arson that has been left off, other, so I'm even grappling with what's not on the list.
Right.
Karen, did you have?
Sorry, just forgot to take my hand on the last time.
Okay. Sheriff Heck.
I'd just like to echo Representative O'Neill's concern. I see it routinely when we're dealing with issuing gun permits, that people are charged with crimes that would exclude them from having firearms. Their history shows as a reason for that, and yet they resolve it at a level which does not then implicate the restrictions for firearms, and oftentimes we have to issue those. So I again would caution about considering the effects this is going to have, as far as how many people are actually going to be restarted then, and how many of these people will escape that because they will have resolved it at a lower level.
Chief Tuscan.
Again, I would like to kind of chime what the sheriff and representative said as well. All too often we're seeing let's make a deal when it comes to prosecutions, and oftentimes this will be another chip that will be used to say, well, let's depart from a felony to because of the need to register. I think that's a concern that we would have, is that will be a chip that will be more often than not used to do a downward departure.
Let's see. So the issue as we're going through this is really the question about, should this be one of the polling questions? Stacy.
So I appreciate the comments of Representative O'Neill and Sheriff Heck and the chief. I think as a policy matter, I think the issue is, are we comfortable with, well, there's two things. There's the risk level of whether this person is going to commit another predatory offense. And we have seen the research that if they're living offense free, that risk goes down very low. If they are, if they do have other offenses that are, let's just say they're non-sex offenses or predatory offenses, that risk goes up a little bit. And I'm not the risk person, Brian and others are. But I think, so that's one issue, is if you're gonna, if we're gonna capture other crime or any crime, any conviction, what does it actually have to do with the risk of committing another offense involving and becoming embroiled in a crime in which that assailant is unknown? So, and the other issue, the other thing I really struggle with is, it just seems like the registry acts as a black hole in a lot of instances, that once you're on, that's it. And so right now, once you're on, any conviction of any crime that results in incarceration gets you another 10 years. And it's that black hole that I think that we need to find a way around. I'm not opposed to the point about downward departures is it's a fair one. I don't know like how often that would happen. I'd be interested in hearing maybe from Jim Fleming on that, in terms of, you know, what is the likelihood of that actually happening, saying, oh, well, you know, in while they're entering, you know, entering the conviction, does the judge really care if this person is going to have to register? And so that there's going to be a downward departure. I don't know. I would guess not. If the crime is serious enough, the judge is probably going to be inclined to be glad that they're going to be on the registry for another, or that it restarts for 10. So I think that we just need to look at this registry as, are we comfortable with it in many cases being a black hole? Or are we looking for ways to help people do right and do good and get off the registry?
Okay, Nate.
Thanks, Mark. My comment was going to be, maybe instead of focusing on the language, we should be focusing on the polling question and sort of what is the principle that we're asking the group to weigh in on. More because I think the language can kind of follow the principle, but what is the principle that we're seeking input?
Well, and I can put sort of what a more simplified version of what the poll question might be. It's not exactly what the poll would be, but probably a simplified way of looking at it. So it's the first one, the restart of registration. So Katie.
I raised my hand. Olivia and Josh are trying to say something, Mark, and they're
Okay.
muted. Yep, thanks.
Okay.
Hi there. So I guess our question was more about the poll, because it sounds like, so previously the goal was to have the language attached to it. But it sounds like some of this language is in flux, and we will want to have that language as close to final as possible. I'm assuming if that's the goal for this poll or survey, before that survey is sent out, because I think it could lend to some confusion. And people's positions may very well change depending upon what the language looks like. So just some food for thought for the chairs.
So yeah, the idea is that the language would go out as Angie presented it. So those concerns about not including misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, should be clear that they are not included in this. So that would probably inform those who would be voting in the poll. So the language is close, but realization that it will always change. I mean, it will change in the report as we get closer to submitting it. And if it actually went forward to the legislature, it would change language at that time also. But the idea here is that there's a pretty general idea of what the poll question is, and that is that it would essentially remove misdemeanors from the restart and would include, for the most part, only felonies.
And one, I guess, maybe too late in the game to deal with this, but, one thing that might address Representative O'Neill's concerns is to now include gross misdemeanors and felonies. So, but again, then there'll be some misdemeanor offenses that maybe would still be of concern to legislators. I don't know, but we should probably clean up the language a little bit before the survey based on discussions today. But yeah, it's, as far as the poll kind of question goes, that general question is what people seem to want to get at.
Sheriff Heck.
I was just going to say, I was even kind of reticent to make my previous comment, because I think the question I have is, is the purpose of today's meeting to finalize the question that we're going to ask the rest of the group, or is it to debate this idea back and forth? Because I think it's clear that there are some differences of opinion about this idea, even in this subgroup. And I would say that in the interest of getting something done, that maybe it's best to come together on just, well, what are we going to ask the group? And then say, okay, so this is a question we're going to ask. And so when it's presented to the group, each side will be allowed to have, a time to present their concerns and their arguments, and then we can ask the group and see what the result is.
Probably a good idea. Mark, one thing I was going to mention is, and sorry, Chris, I know you have your hand up. Even on this language, restart of registration only after felony convictions, crimes against the person convictions, or revocations for those convictions or registration offense. I mean, somehow we should maybe clean that up a little bit, because it's for revocations for also include the registration offenses.
You mean failure to register?
No, the restart applies for revocations on registration offenses too, and those aren't part of felony convictions or crimes against
Well,
personal convictions.
But they are. If they're charged, they restart their registration, so it's not needed in a restart.
It's not a change, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Because the way
So,
this language reads, it sounds like we're not including those anymore, but those would stay, is all I'm saying.
yeah, a conviction for a registration offense requires registration. They don't restart, even under current law.
A revocation though will restart.
Yeah.
A revocation for a
Oh,
registration. That's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. Your language doesn't include that.
yeah,
Am I right, Kate?
yes, yes,
I think I wrong about that. Okay, so Chris, I think, has had his hand up for a while.
yes. Chris,
Thank you. I wanted to go back to Nate's point about what sort of the principle is that's being pursued, and in working on this and based on some of the previous conversations, I think the one of the principles being pursued with drafting new language for the subdivision 6 was the feeling that any new offense involving any day of incarceration would be over-inclusive in trying to have a list that had some what we believe to have some nexus with being likely to reoffend with a sex offense, and the idea being that crimes against a person might be a good way to go, since that those crimes have already been singled out or identified in the statute. I think there's just a split on this because, as has been pointed out, there's also a thought that the principle is sort of leave it as it is, because any criminal activity indicates a likelihood to reoffend. So to Sheriff Heck's point, I think it's, that's just a debate we're going to have. But when I was working on this language, that was sort of the principle, at least I was trying to follow, is to narrow the offenses to ones that had a nexus with a likelihood of reoffense.
yeah, and that could lead to, if you wanted to split it into 2 poll questions, one is don't change it at all, the restart provisions, and the other is put limitations such as crimes against the person, or even a third one, no misdemeanors. Would that sort of cover that issue? Stacy?
I think what Sheriff Hack suggested was, looking at, the broader questions and getting the poll out. I think that that you're right, Mark, that would. I also wonder if we could put in the poll, maybe one way around this, as I called it a black hole, and someone put in the chat, that if the issue, if a concern is the black hole, maybe an option would be to reduce the restart length. And I had suggested that in the chat too. So we keep, maybe we're getting rid of just misdemeanors, but another way to skin the cat is to shorten that time. So there is the penalty. We're gonna track you still more, but it's just for a shorter time. I would suggest that we put that in the poll unless there's some objection to that.
Representative,
10 years for these offenses, but 5 years for anything else, or you're just thinking 5 years across the board?
okay, for Stacy
Oh,
with that,
Yeah, it's just Angie, that's a good question. Maybe it's if the concern of Representative O'Neill and other legislators would be, geez, there's so much crime and we don't want to downward depart and all that sort of thing. Maybe it's categorizing them, that might be a really smart way to do it. It gets a little bit more complex, but the statute is already complex. Adding a little bit of more complexity isn't going to be a big deal.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. No, I saw that in the chat, and I think that would be a really good idea. We can hear from the sheriff and the chief to see what they think, but there is a correlation between even getting a DWI, and maybe Brian could speak to this, so that they are actively involved in their addiction and criminal behavior. I mean, you see it throughout the criminal justice system. When I first started working on the Public Safety Committee and asking these questions, anyone that works in criminal justice knows between 85 and 90% of those that are in the system have an addiction. And it is directly related to criminality. It changes your maturity, your thought process. You guys all know that. So you're going to run up against that at the legislature, because we all know that too. We've been talking about it for almost 10 years, the 10 years I've been there, that addiction and criminal behavior are hand in glove. But that being said, what Stacy just said and what we just talked about, reducing the 10-year restart to a 5-year restart, is probably, it's kind of the sweet spot. I think that could be tolerated or explored, I should say, at the legislature, and that could get some traction with certain, with the misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, some of the lower level charges, convictions. I don't know where you're going to land on that, but I think reducing it probably is a better path than this path. But I'd like to hear from Brian what he thinks about addiction and criminal behavior. I know from my work 10 years in the legislature and asking those questions and going to all of our state prisons and talking to the therapists there multiple times, I know what they've told me, but I'd love to hear that from Brian. And then I'd love to hear from the sheriff and the chief about reducing it to 5 years as a restart.
Yeah, I would just say in general, somebody who has committed past offenses while under the influence of chemicals and based on their addiction would be at increased risk if they continue to use, for sure. Another piece just about the kind of the desistance research that I presented before, that table that I've referred to, where let's say somebody is kind of a moderate risk to reoffend, and based on actuarial scores and other things we've looked at, and then they go a certain number of years completely offense-free, that's going to reduce more than if they've committed other non-sex offenses. So I think Linda put in the chat, is there support that any offense makes it more likely the person will reoffend? To some degree, continuing criminal behavior really above a petty misdemeanor level does, I guess I would say, doesn't lower the risk as much as somebody who goes completely crime-free. But if they've not committed any sex offenses for, let's say, 10 years, and there's been some other crimes, you just reduce their risk less than you would reduce it if they've been completely crime-free. So if I'm making sense, there's, it doesn't reduce the risk as much, but it's still a reduction from, so if somebody's remained completely sex offense-free.
okay, we're approaching the end of our time period here. Want to make sure that we go to the second poll question My understanding at this time is that you may want to have either a number of poll questions or some additional options on that, and perhaps the chairs can talk about that before.
I think it makes sense we talked about, Mark, is, no change, this change,
Yeah.
no misdemeanors, something like that.
The 5 year. Okay. So Chief Tuscan, give you a chance and then we'll try to move on to that mandatory minimum.
Yeah, just to answer the representative's question. Yeah, I think that we would entertain certainly something that may be tiered. And by the way, I will just say, I don't think having a registry with as many people as we have on it necessarily points us to the right direction where we're really for the use it was intended for. So we are, I think, in law enforcement, we are open to change, but it's we just want to make sure that it's meaningful and it doesn't hamstring our ability to hold those into account. And I know everyone on this call agrees with that. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
So in order for us to make sure we cover the other question that was up for consideration, we have remove the mandatory minimum of a year and a day for failure to register to reflect trend in actual prosecutions. And I think maybe if we have Nate address that. There you are.
All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, I guess the elevator pitch was, there were several points. Well, first of all, I wouldn't call it necessarily eliminating the mandatory minimum. I would say eliminating it for first time. So that right now there's a year and a day mandatory minimum for committing the offense at all. And then there's a 2-year mandatory minimum for repeat committing the offense, repeat failure to register convictions. I would propose making it a year and a day for repeat and skipping the mandatory minimum, keeping it a felony, not changing the felony rule, but reducing that mandatory prison term. So I guess my first point would be kind of on an equity point of view. If you look at the racial makeup of the people who are on the registry, it's I guess you could say a lighter complexion than the people who are convicted for failure to register. So which I think is, you get into some economic issues. At least this is my hypothesis. I don't know that I have data for this, but I think you get into some economic issues. This is frankly my experience as a prosecutor. People who tended to get convicted of failure to register tended to be people who were a little bit more marginal in terms of their lifestyle, or it's associated with poverty in my experience. But again, I don't have data to support that. But that would make sense, kind of why there's that equity concern, given statewide data on poverty and race in Minnesota. The second, there's also a fairly broad geographical difference in terms of how this offense is prosecuted. On the public safety side, Brian has told us that failure to register isn't really predictive of general recidivism. It's predictive of more failure to register. But in terms of public safety, there really isn't the kind of public safety impact like that you would expect to see with a mandatory minimum penalty. A mandatory minimum penalty, as I've said, is a big deal in Minnesota, and it's unusual, and you'd expect that there'd be some pretty strong public safety nexus for expending limited prison resources on this kind of a problem, and you just don't see it in the data, according to Brian. It's really more predictive of more failure to register more than predictive of actually committing crimes in general, or sex crimes particularly. On the compliance side, so we learned that the 2000 legislature was told that there was a 70% compliance rate. Well, they were told it was a 30% non-compliance rate, from which I infer a 70% compliance rate. We understand that compliance rate has gone up after they made this change, but they made a number of changes at this time. So we don't know that it was the failure to register that improved it. It could have been just the fact that they made a felony that improved it. So I think keeping it as a felony, keeping the mandatory minimum at a year and a day for repeat offenses, and and keeping all the improvements that we've made in enforcement procedures, I think may be sufficient to maintain the high compliance rate. So that's my pitch. And all I'm asking is just that it be a survey question. Oh, and as you say, Mark, there is a very high departure rate. So I mean, I guess you could say there's sort of been some interest in among prosecutors and judges not to necessarily push the mandatory minimum.
Janine.
Thanks. I just wanted to highlight Renee's comment in the chat about indecent exposure as a misdemeanor, the exchange between Renee and Angie, and just highlighting whether we think about the registry as general criminality or sex crimes. And for sure, with the more narrow sex crimes, I would highlight the indecent exposure component for sure.
Is this on the other question? I think indecent exposure is on the list. If I'm not mistaken, I think I saw it there.
Yeah. So we're going back to that to the mandatory minimum, just to make sure we cover that. Brian.
Just wanted to echo, yeah, what Nate said about, from a public safety standpoint, he said exactly what I had said before about our research and other research from other states just shows that failing to register is not predictive of sex offending, general recidivism, violent recidivism, anything other than another failure to register potentially. So just agreeing with the no need for prison time for, in most cases, for failure to register offenses. And I think just real quickly, the indecent exposure subdivision 2 on the crimes against the person should cover more of the misdemeanor things, I think. Somebody, one of the lawyers can fill me in if I'm incorrect on that, but I think that would be covered.
Well, yeah, I can double check that, and I mean, we can just make sure that that covers the whole statute, if not.
Yeah, all right.
Okay. Sheriff Heck.
I'm not opposed to having this as a survey question. Again, I think I go back to my previous comment that probably the place to debate this is in the large group. I just would offer up the counterpoint that, you know, we don't know that the mandatory minimum is what increased the compliance rate. We don't know that it isn't. I will say that it is valuable to law enforcement to have accurate and timely information in that database, and that things that are done to that database to erode the accuracy and the timeliness of that information make the tool less valuable.
So we're kind of going back to that restart of registration issue. Is there any more comment on the polling question on removing the mandatory minimum for a year? And I updated the language there for first time failure to register.
And I think the sheriff's point was with respect to that. The question is whether eliminating the mandatory minimum would decrease compliance, which would in turn decrease the value of the registry. And he's right. We don't know that this wasn't the magic key that increased compliance from 70% to 95% or whatever it is now. I'm saying there were multiple changes that were made at the same time. One was this was made from a gross misdemeanor of felony, which might have been the key. 2 is it was made, there was this mandatory minimum, which might have been the key, but might not have been. And 3 is I think we really improved our enforcement process since 2000. So any one of those 3 things might have been the thing that increased it. So I think the sheriff has a point. I don't know. I think given the public safety, the lack of public safety needs, though, prison is a pretty heavy hammer for that. I mean, you could even have, you know, mandatory jail time or something. I mean, something to short of sending somebody to prison, which is really, you know, a pretty extreme measure to increase enforcement for something that's not necessarily a public safety issue by itself.
I mean, I'd be okay with having it as a question and seeing what people think. I can't remember, Sheriff Heck, did you not even want it as a question or?
I have no issue with it being a question brought before the group. That's fine with me.
And then just a heads up, I did look at the indecent exposure and we would just probably want to take out subdivision 2 and just have it reflect or add subdivision 1 if we want to include misdemeanor indecent exposure. Because what happens now is for the registration offenses, that includes subdivision 3, which is the felony level. Subdivision 2 is gross misdemeanor under 61723, and subdivision 1 is misdemeanor. So we probably could just say subdivisions 1 and 2.
So if you can craft that later,
Yeah.
that would.
Yeah,
that
I
would be
can
helpful.
I can work on that and the other language that we've talked about already, just to try to make it as good as we can for now.
And then with the understanding that it would probably be a number of polling questions on that same restart that might include that 5-year, would include keep the same, and would include misdemeanors, removing misdemeanors except for those detailed. Anything else on those comments? We can give, let me see. If we have any public members that would like to comment, this is an opportunity. Anybody had anything to say? Representative O'Neill.
So back to the second question that we just left. The Wilder Foundation does a survey of all homeless people around January. They're about to do it again. And the last year when they did it, they found around 8,000, 4,000 of which had just been released from the DOC. And my guess is some of those are going to be on the POR. We don't have that data, but probably, with all the conversations that we've had throughout this whole time, that's been a consistent thing. And there was conversation about making it, again, easier for those that are homeless or transient to be able to easily register. And so I think that should be one of the survey questions. A lot of ideas were put forth, but I think, some of the change that was made that may have been effective in people continuing to register was that they could come into the station and, they made some changes there. So I think one of the survey questions should be on that end of it, making it easier, more streamlined, whatever, more accessible for someone that's transient or homeless to do the registry. So I just wanted to add that. And I wish we had data. I think the whole issue with this whole couple months that we've been doing this is the lack of information, the lack of good data for here in Minnesota. So it's a bit frustrating as a lawmaker to try to decide one thing or another when we don't really know the full picture. So it's, again, another survey question could be just in that general sense that you ask the legislature to spend some money, since we have a $7.7 billion surplus, and build the database better so that we can get data out of it. Also do research, University of Minnesota research or something on giving us better data. So I would like those things added if you would. I think those are things that we've discussed throughout this whole time that I think would be very beneficial.
Yeah, and those are some of the things that we talked about with the co-chairs and Mark and Olivia talked about, in addition to kind of these things we're surveying and the actual language that might be proposed, having some parts of the report that just kind of discuss other issues like the homeless accessibility, the research, or, you know, if we want something, either better research or some kind of better database or something, and the time and money for that. But to address those things in the report in addition to any statutory suggestions.
And Representative O'Neill, for those who get out of prison and are subject to registration, not solely based on juvenile adjudication, we can pull that information. So I'll have that provided to you and others as to show how many are getting out of prison and are homeless.
And if you could add one more caveat to that and have violated what we're talking about right now, which is that the failure to register or to re-register, if you would include that data, it'd be nice to know if we're talking about 2 people or 300.
That may be less available.
See, exactly my point. It seems like we can go so far and then we just kind of hit a wall, and the answer has been consistently, we don't have that data, we can't compile that data. And so that's problematic for lawmakers because we are very data driven.
Jim.
Anecdotally on the failure to register cases, most of these folks that we're talking about are my clients, and they are poor. They do present compelling cases for departure that judges who are not inclined to give departures give them, which for some I can gather is not is troubling, although from my side of it, seems to be equitable. Even though this has been going on for some time, we still have a high compliance rate. So I think if you were to take the first, my professional judgment is that even if you were to take the first time failure to register off, I still think you're going to see a high compliance rate. Even though given that there's been departures, and maybe you might actually see a drop in the number of departures.
And one additional issue I'd like to bring up is about the extension on the report. And if Senator Ingebrigtsen is available to talk about this, a request has been made to give us another about 2 weeks to provide the report so that everybody doesn't have to work over the holiday area. If Senator Ingebrigtsen, if you possibly could connect with Senator Limmer on that issue and
So
whether it would be okay for a 2-week extension.
I can't speak in directly, but I'm thinking it's going to be okay, but I will do that. I will do that right away.
Okay. Yeah, I think there was that request that came to us about making sure that we got a response from Senator Limmer on that request.
Okay. All right. I will do that.
And that would be helpful. Yes, thank you.
All right.
Any other questions? We are probably would be good to take a few-minute break here before the next subgroup meets on crimes. Is that okay? So we'll take a break until 10 o'clock.